Salt's role in history. The history of human civilization is fundamentally a history of energy management. For the vast majority of our species' existence, the primary constraint on expansion was not the lack of food procurement strategies. Hunting and gathering were often remarkably efficient, but the tyranny of time. Biological matter, once separated from the life force of the animal or plant, immediately begins a descent into entropy. Bacterial and enzymatic decomposition starts the moment an animal is slaughtered or a crop is harvested. This decay clock tethered early human populations to their immediate environment. A successful mammoth hunt or a massive haul of migratory fish offered only a fleeting abundance. Without a means to arrest the biological breakdown of protein, the surplus rotted within days. This tether meant that exploration was limited by the metabolic requirements of the explorers and the shelf life of their provisions. To travel was to starve, unless one could carry the harvest of the summer into the depths of winter, or transport the protein of the coast into the barren interior. The Preservation Revolution, driven by the mastery of sodium chloride, was the technological breakthrough that severed this tether. It was not merely a culinary adjustment, but a profound shift in human ecology. By mastering the chemistry of curing, using salt to desiccate flesh and create a hypertonic environment hostile to microbial life, societies could stockpile energy. This capability transformed the Atlantic cod from a perishable biological entity into a durable economic unit, a dinosaur of economic history that fueled the European colonization of North America. It allowed navies to project power across oceans, sustained by barrels of salted beef that remained edible for months or even years. To achieve this, humanity had to industrialize the production of salt itself, turning it from a gathered curiosity into a mass-produced industrial commodity. This first part of the review provides an exhaustive analysis of this revolution. It examines how civilizations harnessed the forces of nature through the hydraulic engineering of coastal salterns and the thermal physics of brine boiling. It details the industrial scaling of preservation technologies that allowed for the provisioning of massive expeditions and the economic specialization of entire regions. Finally, it pivots from the macroeconomics of survival to the micro-sociology of the dining table, analyzing how this precious mineral, once extracted, became a potent symbol of social stratification, dividing the medieval banquet hall into spheres of the elite and the common, defined simply by who sat above or below the salt. Chemistry of preservation. To understand the profound impact of salt on human history, one must first appreciate the microscopic battlefield upon which the war against spoilage is fought. The preservation of meat, fish, and vegetables is not a simple act of drying. It is a complex chemical intervention that alters the fundamental environment of the foodstuff to render it hostile to life's microscopic competitors. The primary mechanism by which salt preserves food is osmosis. Microorganisms, including the bacteria, Salmonella, E. coli, and molds that cause spoilage, are essentially aquatic entities. They require unbound water within food tissues to survive, metabolize, and reproduce. When salt is applied to the surface of meat or fish, it dissolves in the surface moisture to create a hypertonic solution, a brine with a high concentration of solute. Nature abhors this imbalance. Through the process of osmosis, water molecules within the cells of the food migrate across the cell membranes toward the area of higher salt concentration in an attempt to equalize the pressure. This massive efflux of water effectively dehydrates the food from the inside out. Simultaneously, the salt ions penetrate the tissue. For the bacteria attempting to colonize this tissue, the environment becomes lethal. The high osmotic pressure draws water out of the bacterial cells themselves, causing plasmolysis. the shrinking and collapse of the cell membrane away from the cell wall. The bacteria literally dry out and die, or at the very least, enter a state of suspended animation where reproduction is impossible. This reduction in water activity, a measure of the water available for biological reactions, is the cornerstone of all salt preservation. However, the historical salt used by our ancestors was rarely pure sodium chloride. It was a geological cocktail containing various impurities, the most consequential of which were nitrates and nitrites, often in the form of saltpeter or potassium nitrate. The presence of these compounds, often accidental at first, revolutionized meat preservation. While simple dehydration can preserve meat, it leaves the tissue a distinct, unappetizing gray and susceptible to oxidation or rancidity. The ancients discovered that certain rock salts or sea salts produced a meat that remained vibrantly pink or red and possessed a superior flavor. We now understand this as the curing reaction. Nitrate-reducing bacteria, naturally present in the meat, convert the nitrate in the salt into nitrite. This nitrite then reduces to nitric oxide, which binds with the myoglobin protein in the muscle fibers. This chemical bond forms nitrosomyoglobin, a stable red pigment that gives ham, bacon, and corned beef their characteristic color. More critically, nitrite acts as a potent antimicrobial agent specifically against Clostridium botulinum, the deadly bacterium responsible for botulism. In the anaerobic or oxygen-free environment of a dense ham or a sealed barrel of beef, Clostridium botulinum would thrive if not for the specific inhibitory action of nitrites. Thus, the preservation revolution was not just about drying, it was about the mastery of complex chemical reactions that ensured safety and aesthetic appeal, transforming raw flesh into a culturally prized artifact, the cured meat. The application of this chemistry took two primary forms, each suited to different logistical needs. Dry curing involved rubbing the meat with coarse salt and allowing the drawn-out fluids to drain away. This method was labor-intensive and relied on the salt penetrating the meat by diffusion over weeks. It was ideal for hams and stockfish, dried cod, creating a product that was lightweight, incredibly durable, and capable of lasting for years in dry conditions. Wet pickling or brining involved immersing the food in a pre-made saltwater solution. This required watertight cooperage, barrels, and casks, which itself drove a secondary industry in wood and iron. Wet pickling was faster and ensured more uniform coverage, making it the preferred method for the massive industrial provisioning of navies. The meat remained heavy with moisture, but the brine acted as a liquid shield against oxygen and insects. The choice between dry and wet methods often dictated the logistics of the exploration that followed. Dry provisions allowed for lighter loads, while wet provisions offered calorie-dense hydration but required heavy storage vessels. Coastal salterns, the solar engine and hydraulic architecture. The production of salt on a scale sufficient to preserve the food stocks of nations required a mastery of environmental forces. Whether through the manipulation of solar energy in coastal marshes or the intensive consumption of fossil fuels in northern boiling houses, the manufacture of salt was one of the earliest and most complex forms of chemical engineering. It required a synthesis of geology, meteorology, and metallurgy to extract a pure chemical compound from the chaotic mixture of seawater or subterranean brine. In the warmer latitudes of Europe and the Mediterranean, where the sun's intensity coincided with favorable drying winds, salt production relied on the architecture of the landscape itself. The coastal saltern, or salt marsh, was not a passive drying pan, but a sophisticated hydraulic machine designed to fractionate seawater through gravity and evaporation. The salt marshes of Guérande in Brittany and Trapani in Sicily serve as prime historical examples of this synthesis between topography and technique, where the coastline was terraformed to harvest the sun. The engineering of a historical salt marsh began with the management of the tides. The system was designed to admit seawater at high tide into a primary reservoir, known in the French tradition as the vasière. This vast basin, which might comprise up to 40% of the total surface area of the salt works, acted as both a storage tank and a settling pond. Here, the water was held to allow suspended particles, silt, and mud to settle, preventing them from contaminating the final harvest. The vasière was hydraulically linked to the ocean via canals or étiers, and the admission of water was controlled by trapdoors, requiring the paludier, salt worker, to possess an intimate knowledge of tidal cycles and hydraulic gradients. The design of these reservoirs often dated back centuries, with some infrastructure in Guérande tracing its origins to the engineering of monks in the 10th century, who studied the interplay of wind, sun, and tide to optimize the layout. From the vasière, the brine did not move directly to crystallization. It had to be concentrated through a meticulous staging process. The water was guided by gravity into a series of evaporation ponds, known as cobiers. The architecture of the cobier was designed to maximize surface area and exposure to the wind, which was critical as the sun in driving evaporation. As the water meandered through these basins, its salinity rose significantly. This stage was not only chemical, but biological. The cobier was often where the brine became concentrated enough to kill off competitors like algae, limu, and crustaceans, which the salt workers viewed as enemies of the harvest because they could contaminate the salt or disrupt the formation of crystals. The control of flow was achieved through a labyrinthian system of clay walls and channels. The soil itself was a critical structural component. It had to be heavy clay to ensure waterproofing between the different levels. If the soil were permeable, the precious concentrated brine would leach away, destroying the yield. Thus, the construction of a saltern was a massive earth-moving project, reshaping the coastline to create an impermeable, tiered landscape. The maintenance of these clay walls was a constant labor, requiring the paludier to repair erosion and ensure the structural integrity of the basins against the encroaching sea. The final stage of this solar engine occurred in the ylets, or crystallization tanks. These were smaller, shallow basins where the brine reached saturation. Here, the preservation revolution relied on two distinct physical phenomena, producing two grades of salt, each serving a different function in the food economy. The first phenomenon was the precipitation of heavy crystals onto the clay bottom, forming the gros sel, or gray salt. This salt took on the mineral characteristics and color of the clay substrate, rich in magnesium and potassium. It was harvested by raking the bottom of the pan, a physically demanding task that required care to avoid pulling up too much mud. This coarse gray salt was the engine of preservation, used in bulk for curing meat and fish because of its lower cost and high mineral content, which some historical practitioners believed penetrated the flesh of fish more effectively. The second phenomenon was the formation of fleur de sel. Under specific weather conditions, hot sun and a dry breeze, a delicate crust of pyramidal crystals would form on the very surface of the water, held up by surface tension. This flower of salt was harvested gently with a specialized wooden rake called a luce before it could sink. Historically, this differentiation was crucial. The coarse gray salt was the industrial preservative, while the fleur de sel was a luxury finishing salt, prized for its texture and purity, and reserved for the tables of the elite rather than the barrels of the Navy. The reliance on solar evaporation bound production to climate. In the Mediterranean, the hot sun and warm, drying winds made places like Trapani ideal for harvesting. The Phoenicians and later the Romans exploited these conditions, building infrastructure that utilized windmills to pump brine between tanks, creating a mechanized landscape. The Roman mastery of hydraulic cement and aqueduct technology allowed them to build durable sluices and channels, ensuring that their saltworks were immune to the erosion of the sea. However, as the demand for preserved fish pushed populations northward, the solar engine faltered. In the damp, cool climates of northern Europe, the sun was insufficient to drive the massive evaporation required. To salt the fleets of the North Sea, humanity had to turn to fire. Specialized brine boiling, the thermal engine of the North. In regions like Cheshire in England, Lüneburg in Germany, or the Austrian Alps, salt was extracted not from the sea, but from ancient subterranean brine springs or rock salt deposits. Here, the energy source shifted from solar radiation to the combustion of biomass and fossil fuels. This shift necessitated a different set of technologies and created a voracious appetite for fuel that reshaped landscapes and economies. The core technology of the northern salt industry was the boiling pan. The evolution of this vessel tells the story of medieval metallurgy and thermal engineering. Early production utilized ceramic vessels or briquetage, but by the Roman period and into the Middle Ages, lead pans became the standard. Lead was favored because it was malleable, easy to repair, and did not rust, which ensured the salt remained white. A standard Cheshire salt house might contain 6 lead pans. However, lead has a relatively low melting point. As salt makers sought to increase production speeds to meet the demands of expanding populations, they transitioned from wood fires to hotter-burning coal. The intense heat of coal fires, necessary to drive rapid evaporation, would melt the lead pans. Consequently, the industry was forced to transition to riveted wrought iron pans. This transition from lead to iron was not without cost. Iron pans were expensive to fabricate, difficult to transport, and unlike lead, could not be easily recycled. Furthermore, the brine was corrosive. Iron pans rusted, and the rust could discolor the salt, turning it brown or red, a defect that lowered its value significantly in a market that equated whiteness with purity. To combat this, salt makers developed pansmithing as a specialized trade, and the maintenance of these vessels became a constant industrial expense. The pans grew in size over the centuries, from small vessels to massive industrial basins measuring hundreds of square feet, requiring complex flues and masonry supports to distribute the heat evenly. The operation of these pans required esoteric technical knowledge, often guarded as trade secrets by the master salters. The process of making salt in a pan was not simply boiling water until it disappeared. It was a controlled crystallization sequence. The brine was first pumped into the pan and brought to a violent boil, a stage known as sludging. As the water evaporated, impurities like calcium carbonate and iron would precipitate first, often forming a dirty scum. To produce white, high-quality salt, this scum had to be removed. Medieval and early modern salt masters developed a sophisticated chemistry of additives to clarify the brine. They added blood, egg whites, or ale to the boiling liquid. The proteins in these organic materials would coagulate in the heat, trapping the impurities in a foam that rose to the surface, which could then be skimmed off by the waller. Once clarified, the heat was adjusted for the soakage or crystallization phase. The speed of evaporation determined the texture of the salt, a critical variable for food preservation. Rapid boiling produced fine crystals, suitable for butter and table use. Slow simmering, often over days, produced large, coarse crystals known as fishery salt or bay salt. These large crystals were essential for curing fish because they dissolved slowly, maintaining a high salinity brine around the flesh for the duration of long voyages. If fine salt were used for fish, it would dissolve too quickly, drawing out moisture too fast and potentially burning the outside of the fish while leaving the inside vulnerable to rot. To encourage the formation of these specific crystal structures, salt makers used additives like butter, tallow, and even earwax or specialized glues. These surfactants altered the surface tension of the brine, preventing the crystals from sinking too quickly, or encouraging them to form large hollow pyramids known as hopper crystals. The critical moment in this process was known as the leap, the point at which the brine became supersaturated and crystallization began in earnest. Recognizing this moment required the experienced eye of the waller, who managed the fires and the raking. In Cheshire, the ruler of walling was an official who enforced strict regulations on pan size and boiling times, walling in kale, to ensure quality and prevent resource exhaustion. The fuel required for this industry was immense, leading to early ecological crises. In Lüneburg, the saltworks consumed the forests of the surrounding heathlands. When wood ran out, they turned to peat. In the Netherlands, the salt refining industry, which supported the massive herring trade, consumed vast amounts of peat per refinery per year. This demand for thermal energy, distinct from the kinetic energy of windmills, drove the excavation of vast peat bogs, altering the physical geography of the Low Countries. In Læsø, Denmark, the salt industry eventually consumed all the island's timber, turning the landscape into a windswept desert and forcing the industry to collapse in the mid-17th century. In England, the shift to coal in the 17th century allowed production to scale up, but it tethered the salt industry to the coal fields, creating the dark, smoky industrial landscapes of the witch towns like Northwich, Middlewich, and Nantwich. Industrial-scale operations and economic specialization. The ability to produce salt on an industrial scale did not merely employ wallers and paludiers, it reshaped the economies of entire regions, driving specialization and technological innovation. The preservation revolution was, at its heart, an export revolution. The Hanseatic League, a commercial powerhouse of the medieval North, was built largely on the synergy between Lüneburg salt and Scania herring. Lüneburg became a specialized industrial city, its entire existence revolving around the salt mine at its core. The mine was a fortress surrounded by walls and towers guarding the saline treasure. The scale of operation was massive, 54 boiling huts containing over 200 boiling pans, all fed by a complex system of canals and buckets. This was not a cottage industry, it was a factory system. The ownership structure reflected this importance. The salt gentry, Zolzbegüterte, owned the pans but leased them to master salters, Zulfmeister, creating a hierarchy of capital and labor that dominated the city's politics. The salt produced here was transported to Lübeck and then to the Scania market in southern Sweden. Here, in a seasonal frenzy of commerce, hundreds of thousands of barrels of herring were gutted, salted, and packed. This trade was so vital that it allowed for the expansion of populations far from the fishing grounds. Hanseatic grain was traded for Norwegian stockfish, allowing permanent settlements to thrive in the Arctic north of Norway, where local agriculture could not support them. This industrial scale drove technological innovation in related fields, most notably cooperage. A single ship could not transport loose piles of salt or fish, they needed watertight, durable casks. The cooperage industry, the making of barrels, became a critical specialized trade. Coopers became essential artisans, using heat and steam to bend oak staves into vessels that could hold brine without leaking. The standardization of barrel sizes, tierces, hogsheads, and puncheons, was necessary for international trade. A leaky barrel meant not just the loss of brine, but the rotting of the meat inside, which could spell disaster for a ship at sea. Thus, the cooper was as vital to exploration as the navigator. In the 18th century, the British Navy's demand for salt provisions drove the standardization of meat packing. Navy victuallers followed precise technical specifications to ensure that the flesh of Irish cows and Hampshire pigs could circumnavigate the globe. Meat was dry rubbed with white salt, soaked in a blood-clearing brine for days to remove impurities that would cause spoilage, and then packed in casks with bay salt between every layer. The final brine poured into the cask had to be strong enough to float an egg, a pragmatic density test used by sailors and provisioners to ensure the solution was hypertonic enough to halt bacterial growth. This preservation technology was the logistical backbone of empire. Without it, the Royal Navy could not have maintained blockades or patrolled distant colonies. In Cheshire, the demand for brine drove the development of pumping technology. As the surface springs were exhausted, shafts were sunk deeper. This required the use of steam engines to pump the brine to the surface, integrating the salt industry with the nascent steam technology of the Industrial Revolution. However, this extraction had environmental consequences. The aggressive pumping of brine led to catastrophic subsidence, with craters opening up in towns like Northwich as the underlying salt rock was dissolved away, a literal collapsing of the earth under the weight of the demand for preservation. The economic specialization extended to the workforce. A salt works employed a diverse array of specialists: lumpmen who molded the fine salt into blocks for drying, firemen who managed the voracious coal furnaces, lofters who moved the product to warehouses, and pansmiths who repaired the corroding iron vessels. This division of labor foreshadowed the factory systems of the 19th century, creating a specialized industrial proletariat focused solely on the production of the mineral that kept the rest of the world fed. Salt cellar as a demarcation of status. While the industrial production of salt enabled the survival of populations and the provisioning of armies, the consumption of salt within the household served a radically different function. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, salt was a potent tool of social theater. It was a substance of such value and symbolic weight that its presentation on the dining table defined the hierarchy of the room. The transition of salt from a bulk preservative in the barrel to a refined crystal in the cellar marked the boundary between the economics of survival and the aesthetics of power. The vessel holding the salt, known as the salt cellar from the French salière, was often the most expensive and elaborate object in a noble household. It was not merely a container, it was a centerpiece that signaled the wealth and power of the host. In an era where salt extraction was laborious and expensive, the ability to display a large quantity of pure, white salt in a vessel of gold or silver was a direct assertion of status. These vessels, often called great salts or standing salts because they remained stationary while guests dined, were masterpieces of the goldsmith's art. They were frequently crafted from precious materials like rock crystal, agate, silver gilt, and enamel. The most famous surviving example, the Salière by Benvenuto Cellini, 1543, is a sculpture of gold and enamel depicting the allegorical union of land and sea, with a small boat to hold the salt. This object was so valuable that it served as a diplomatic gift between kings. Similarly, the Berglinaf, a salt cellar shaped like a ship using a nautilus shell, exemplifies the fusion of maritime themes with dining luxury. The choice of a ship shape was not accidental. It reminded the diner that the condiment before them was the product of vast trade networks and maritime dominance. The salt cellar was often the first item placed on the table and the last removed. It was treated with a reverence bordering on the religious. In some traditions, the salt cellar was covered with a cloth or a lid to prevent contamination, but also to guard against a pervasive fear of the era: poison. Among the most spectacular forms of the salt cellar was the nef. Shaped like a medieval sailing ship, carrack, or galleon, the nef was a massive piece of plate that sat before the host. The symbolism was multi-layered. The ship represented the source of the salt, the sea, and the source of the host's wealth, trade, and exploration. It was often named like a real ship. The Duke of Orleans owned a nef named the porcupine. The nef was more than a salt container. It was a personal safe. The hull of the silver ship often contained the Lord's personal cutlery, his napkin, and his assay tools. In a time of political assassination, eating was a dangerous act. The assay was a ritual test for poison. The inventory of King Charles V mentions that his nef contained an assay in the form of a serpent's tongue. This was typically a fossilized shark tooth, Glysopetra, which was believed to sweat or change color in the presence of toxins. The salt, being a granular substance easily mixed with arsenic or other poisons, was a primary vector for assassination. Therefore, the Lord's salt was kept in the closed hull of the nef, guarded and tested, while the common guests used open salts. The placement of the salt cellar was a matter of strict diplomatic protocol. In 1378, when King Charles V of France hosted the Holy Roman Emperor and the King of Germany, a crisis arose regarding who should have the salt placed before them. To place it before one would insult the others. The solution was to place 3 separate, equally magnificent salt cellars on the table, allowing each monarch to maintain his dignity. This incident highlights that the salt cellar was not just a dining accessory, but a proxy for the monarch himself. The physical location of the Great Salt on the long trestle tables of the medieval hall created a visible line of demarcation. This gave rise to the idiom of sitting above or below the salt. The high table, usually raised on a dais, was where the Lord, his family, and honored guests sat. The Great Salt was placed here, often directly in front of the Lord or to his right. Those seated above the salt, that is, between the salt cellar and the head of the table, were the elite. They had access to the high-quality white salt contained in the master vessel. This salt was likely refined through the sludging process with egg whites to ensure its purity and whiteness. It was free of grit and bitterness, a culinary luxury. Down the length of the hall, extending away from the dais, sat the lower-ranking members of the household, retainers, minor clergy, and servants. They sat below the salt. They did not have access to the Great Salt. Instead, they relied on trencher salts, small, simple depressions carved into stale bread or coarse wooden bowls placed near their settings. The distinction was not just one of vessel, but of substance. The salt available to the peasantry and the lower household was often black or gray salt, unrefined, containing grit, mud, and the chemical impurities of the pan. While the elite enjoyed the fleur de sel or clarified white salt, the lower orders consumed the common salt produced by rapid hot boiling or simple solar evaporation without the careful washing of the crystals. This dietary difference reinforced the social barrier. The very taste of food differed depending on one's station. The elite literally experienced a purer, cleaner world than their subordinates. The etiquette of using salt was also strictly regulated. One did not dip meat directly into the salt cellar, as this was considered uncouth. Instead, a diner was expected to use the tip of their knife to transfer a small pile of salt onto their trencher plate, where they would then dip their meat. To do otherwise was to risk contaminating the communal supply, a breach of manners that could see one demoted to a lower seat. This ritual required dexterity and adherence to a code of conduct that further distinguished the refined elite from the rough manners of the lower classes. This second part explores the profound historical sociology of salt, moving beyond its chemical properties to examine its role as an agent of historical change. We will analyze how the desperate physiological need for salt allowed states to forge coercive tax systems that chained the subject to the sovereign. We will trace the ancient arteries of commerce, mapping how the logistical demands of transporting heavy salt slabs laid the physical foundations for globalization. We will investigate the weaponization of salt in total war, where the deprivation of this mineral proved as deadly as the cannon or the musket. We will descend into the mines to witness the brutal political economy of extraction, from the penal slaves of Rome to the serfs of Europe. We will ascend to the altars of the divine to understand why this preservative became a universal symbol of eternal covenants. Finally, we will trace the biological trajectory of salt, from a scarce nutrient that shaped our evolution to an industrial additive that fuels a modern public health crisis. Chinese Gabelle, the blueprint of state monopoly. The concept of the state salt monopoly finds its earliest and most sophisticated theoretical articulation in ancient China, serving as the blueprint for bureaucratic resource control. The genesis of this policy is attributed to Guanzhong, the 7th century BCE chancellor of the state of Qi. Guanzhong's economic philosophy was rooted in a pragmatic, almost Machiavellian understanding of human psychology and administrative efficiency. In his dialogues with Duke Huan, recorded in the Guanzi texts, Guanzhong argued against direct taxation on people or land. He posited that direct levies inevitably bred resentment, leading the populace to hide assets and loudly protest against the government. Instead, he extolled the virtues of indirect taxation embedded in the price of essential goods, specifically salt and iron. He argued that by controlling the mountains and seas, the sources of iron and salt, the state could extract revenue from every consumption event, every bowl of soup, every preserved fish, without the need for heavy-handed tax collectors knocking on doors. The people would pay the tax daily, unknowingly, and thus without rebellion. This theoretical framework was institutionalized on an imperial scale during the Han Dynasty under Emperor Wu, r. 141 to 87 BCE. Facing the immense financial strain of prolonged military campaigns against the nomadic Xiongnu Confederacy and seeking to finance expansion into Korea and Vietnam, Emperor Wu sought new revenue streams that would not alienate the peasantry through direct agrarian taxes. In 119 BCE, at the urging of his legalist advisors, the emperor nationalized the salt and iron industries. The state established government-run monopolies that controlled production, transport, and pricing, channeling the immense profits of the trade directly into the imperial treasury. This move was not merely fiscal, but deeply political. It aimed to strip wealth and power from the private merchant class, which had grown dangerously influential, rivaling the state itself in localized power. The implementation of this monopoly was not without fierce intellectual and moral opposition. Following the death of Emperor Wu, the court convened a famous debate in 81 BCE, known as the Discourses on Salt and Iron. This event highlighted a sharp divide in Chinese political philosophy regarding the purpose of government. On one side stood the modernists, or legalists, represented by the Lord Grand Secretary Song Hongyang. They argued that the state had a duty to control key resources to fund border defenses, stabilize prices, and prevent the tyranny of private monopolists. They viewed the salt revenue as essential for national security and the maintenance of order, asserting that wealthy private industrialists were brutal and tyrannical, and that their profits should be redirected to the state. Opposing them were the reformists, primarily Confucian literati. They advocated for a minimalist government and attacked the monopoly on moral grounds. They argued that for the state to seek profit was equivalent to stealing from the people and competing with the merchant class. They contended that trade promotes dishonesty and that state involvement in commerce undermined public morality. Furthermore, they raised practical complaints, noting that the state-run ironworks produced inferior tools that were ill-suited for farming, forcing peasants to buy useless implements to meet quotas. Despite the moral censure of the Confucians, the fiscal logic of the legalists prevailed. The salt tax, known as the Gabelle in Western historiography, became an enduring feature of the Chinese state. By the Tang dynasty, particularly after the An Lushan rebellion decimated other revenue sources, the salt monopoly became the bloodline of the empire. Emperor Daizong and his chancellor Yanyan reformed the tax system, but the reliance on salt remained absolute. At its peak, the salt monopoly accounted for more than half of the central government's total revenue. The administration evolved from direct state production to a system of official supervision, merchant transportation, where the state sold rights to private merchants who handled distribution. This public-private partnership created a wealthy class of salt merchants, particularly in the city of Yangzhou. These merchants, acting as agents of the state, amassed fortunes that allowed them to build elaborate gardens and patronize the arts, yet they remained ultimately beholden to the imperial court. The Chinese Gabelle demonstrated that a state could successfully finance itself through the control of a single mineral, provided it maintained the bureaucratic machinery to enforce the monopoly. French Gabelle, Inequality, Smuggling, and Revolution. If the Chinese monopoly was a model of bureaucratic efficiency, the French Gabelle was a symbol of despotic inequality and administrative chaos. Introduced as a temporary measure in the 13th century to fund crusades and wars, the salt tax became a permanent and universally reviled fixture of the Ancien regime. Unlike the unified Chinese system, the French Gabelle was characterized by a patchwork of regional exemptions, privileges, and disparities that fractured the kingdom and turned the consumption of salt into a daily political struggle. France was divided into 6 distinct tax zones, each with a radically different salt regime. The Pays des Grandes Gabelles, including Paris and the central provinces, bore the heaviest burden. Here, salt was taxed at exorbitant rates, sometimes 10 to 20 times the cost of production. To ensure revenue, the state imposed the devoir de Gabelle, or salt duty, a hated mandate requiring every subject over the age of 8 to purchase a minimum quota of salt annually from the royal warehouses, greniers. This mandatory salt was designated solely for pot and salt cellar, daily cooking. Using it for salting meat or preserving fish was illegal, forcing peasants to purchase additional taxed salt for preservation. This turned the act of preserving food, essential for survival, into a heavily regulated and taxed activity. In stark contrast, the Pays de Quart-Bouillon, Normandy, enjoyed lower taxes, while the Pays Francs, free provinces like Brittany, were exempt entirely. This geographic disparity created a massive arbitrage opportunity that gave rise to widespread smuggling. Smugglers, known as faux-sauniers, transported salt from the duty-free zones into the high-tax regions, undercutting the state monopoly. The price difference was staggering. In 1781, there was a price difference of approximately 55 livres at the border of Brittany. This created a lucrative underground economy that involved men, women, and children. The state's response to this smuggling was brutal and militarized. A specialized police force, the Gabellus, patrolled the internal borders, conducting intrusive searches of private homes, barns, and travelers. The penalties for smuggling were draconian, ranging from flogging and branding to service in the galleys or execution. The galleys of France were frequently populated by peasants whose only crime was attempting to buy affordable salt to cure their pork. This repression sparked violent resistance, most notably the revolt of the Pitots in 1548 in Guyenne. The revolt began when the salt tax was extended to the southwest provinces. Peasants and townspeople rose up, killing tax collectors and chanting "Death to the Gabellus." The crown was forced to brutally suppress the uprising, executing leaders and suspending the Parliament of Bordeaux, Yet the memory of the violence checked the monarchy's power to fully unify the tax system. The Gabelle did more than extract revenue. It delegitimized the monarchy. The tax was universally reviled, not just for its cost, but for its profound unfairness. The nobility and clergy were often exempt, shifting the burden entirely onto the third estate, the peasantry and working class, who spent a significant percentage of their meager income on this survival necessity. For the bottom 70% of the population in the high-tax regions, the salt tax absorbed approximately 6.1% of their income, and for agricultural laborers it could reach nearly 10%. The perceived injustice of the Gabelle fueled a deep resentment that crystallized during the Enlightenment. Reformers cited the salt tax as the ultimate example of the irrationality and cruelty of the feudal system. It is no coincidence that the repeal of the Gabelle was the first act of the National Assembly in 1790, following the outbreak of the French Revolution. The Gabelle remains a historical warning of how inequitable taxation of essential goods can shatter the political stability of a state. British salt tax in India, the Imperial Hedge. In the context of British colonialism in India, the taxation of salt evolved into a mechanism of total imperial control, epitomizing the exploitative nature of the colonial relationship. The British East India Company, and later the British Raj, established a monopoly over salt production, outlawing the traditional manufacturing of salt by Indians from seawater or inland lakes. This policy forced the Indian population, tens of millions of whom lived in poverty, to purchase expensive British imported salt or government-manufactured salt, upon which a heavy tax was levied. To enforce this monopoly and prevent the smuggling of untaxed salt from the princely states, which were not under direct British administration, into British territory, the colonial government constructed one of the most immense and surreal barriers in human history, the Inland Customs Line. Running for over 2,500 miles from the Himalayas to Orissa, a distance comparable to the length of the Great Wall of China, this line was fortified by the Great Hedge of India. This living wall, perfected under the administration of Alan Octavian Hume in the late 1660s, was composed of thorny trees and shrubs like babool, Indian plum, karanda, and prickly pear. At its peak, the hedge stood up to 12 feet high and 14 feet thick, an impenetrable barrier of thorns designed to stop men and camels alike. It was patrolled by an army of 14,000 customs officers whose sole purpose was to seize contraband salt and enforce the tax. The human cost of this tax was staggering. For an Indian laborer, the salt tax represented approximately 2 months' wages per year. The high price led to a reduction in salt consumption among the poorest, which in a tropical climate where salt is lost rapidly through sweat, had severe health consequences. The tax effectively siphoned wealth from the starving peasantry to the imperial metropole, generating millions of pounds in revenue for the British government. The customs line was not just a fiscal tool, it was a physical manifestation of the divide between the ruler and the ruled, a barrier that severed communities and trade routes to ensure the flow of silver. It was this potent symbolism of the salt tax, a foreign power taxing a natural necessity of the soil, that Mahatma Gandhi seized upon in 1930. The Salt March, Salt Satyagraha, was a masterstroke of political theater and strategic resistance. By marching 240 miles to the sea at Dandi and publicly gathering a handful of salt from the beach, Gandhi shattered the psychological hold of British law. He did not merely protest a tax, he reclaimed the right of the Indian people to their own land and resources. The act of making salt became an act of independence. The salt tax, designed to enforce submission, ultimately became the catalyst for the unraveling of British authority in India. The transition from the Great Hedge to the Salt March illustrates the trajectory of the subject-state relationship, from physical containment and extraction to moral awakening and liberation. Infrastructure and trade routes, the arteries of globalization. Long before the advent of the Silk Road or the spice trade, salt was moving across continents. The biological imperative to acquire salt, combined with its uneven geological distribution, necessitated the creation of the world's earliest long-distance trade networks. Salt is heavy, bulky, and susceptible to dissolution by moisture, making its transport a formidable logistical challenge. The infrastructure developed to solve this challenge, roads, bridges, canals, and caravan routes, became the arteries of ancient commerce, facilitating not just the flow of mineral sodium, but the exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultures. The axiom that all roads lead to Rome obscures the fact that one of the first roads led away from Rome, specifically to get salt. The Via Salaria, Salt Road, is one of the most ancient thoroughfares in Italy, predating the paved Roman road system. Its origins lie in the prehistoric trade between the Sabines of the interior Apennines and the salt pans at the mouth of the Tiber River. The city of Rome itself was arguably founded at a strategic choke point on this salt route, allowing the early Romans to control the traffic of salt from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the inland tribes. The name Salaria is derived directly from the Latin sal, salt, cementing its primary function in the linguistic record. As Rome expanded from a city-state to an empire, the Via Salaria was transformed from a dirt track into a feat of engineering. The Romans paved the road with basalt polygons, engineered drainage ditches, and constructed stone bridges to span the rugged terrain of central Italy, such as the Ponte del Gran Casso. This infrastructure did more than move salt. It facilitated the rapid movement of legions, the communication of imperial decrees, and the integration of the Italian peninsula into a unified political entity. The road connected the salt pans of Ostia with the Adriatic coast at Castrum Truentinum, effectively linking the two seas and creating a trans-peninsular economic corridor. This early infrastructure set a precedent for the Roman approach to globalization, the use of state-funded engineering to facilitate resource extraction and mobility. The legacy of the Via Salaria extends into the linguistic and cultural fabric of the West. The Roman soldier, reliant on salt for health and food preservation, received an allowance to purchase it, known as the salarium, the etymological root of the modern word salary. While Rome paved roads of stone, the merchants of North Africa navigated a dry sea of sand. The trans-Saharan trade routes were the backbone of the African medieval economy, linking the Mediterranean coast with the gold-rich empires of the Sahel, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. The driving force of this trade was a fundamental ecological imbalance. The north had abundant salt from mines like Tagaza and Taudeni, but lacked gold. The south had immense gold reserves, but in the sodium-poor interior of West Africa, desperately needed salt for survival. The logistics of this trade were staggering. The Azalai, the great salt caravans, consisted of thousands of camels, sometimes up to 12,000 in a single train, traversing one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The journey required precise navigation by Berber guides who read the stars and the dunes, and the careful management of water supplies. Runners were sent days ahead to oases to draw water, ensuring the caravan could drink immediately upon arrival. The cargo was slabs of rock salt mined in the desolate settlement of Tagaza, a place where buildings were constructed from salt blocks because no other material existed. These slabs were cut from the desert floor and transported south to trading hubs like Timbuktu and Jenne. Upon reaching the Sahel, the salt was exchanged for gold, ivory, and slaves. Historical accounts describe the exchange rate as exorbitant. In times of scarcity, salt could trade weight for weight with gold. This salt-gold nexus fueled the rise of the great West African empires, funding the construction of mosques, universities, and libraries. The trade routes also served as vectors for the spread of Islam and literacy into West Africa, integrating the region into the broader Islamic world. The myth of the silent trade, where merchants would leave goods and retreat, allowing the other side to leave gold without direct contact, speaks to the mystique and high stakes of this exchange. These salt routes were the pre-modern equivalent of global shipping lanes, binding distinct ecological zones into a single, complex economic system. Strategic warfare, the white gold of conflict. In the history of warfare, salt has been a strategic resource of comparable importance to gunpowder or petroleum. Before the invention of refrigeration and modern canning, salt was the only viable method for preserving meat and fodder for armies on the march. A soldier without salt was a soldier without protein, vulnerable to malnutrition and disease. Furthermore, salt was essential for treating wounds, maintaining the health of cavalry horses, and curing the leather used for saddles, boots, and harnesses. Consequently, the disruption of an enemy's salt supply has been a decisive tactic in total war. The American Civil War provides the most striking case study of salt deprivation as a deliberate military strategy. The Confederacy, while rich in cotton and tobacco, was critically deficient in domestic salt production, relying heavily on imports. Recognizing this vulnerability, the Union instituted a naval blockade that strangled the South's salt supply. As the war progressed, the price of salt in the South skyrocketed, rising from cents to hundreds of dollars per sack. This salt famine threatened not just the army, but the civilian population, leading to desperation where families boiled the dirt from smokehouse floors to reclaim salt drippings. The scarcity was so acute that state governors sent frantic letters to President Jefferson Davis, warning that the destitution of salt is alarming and that the population was subsisting on unsalted vegetables. Union strategy explicitly targeted Confederate salt infrastructure. General William Tecumseh Sherman declared salt to be contraband, as vital as gunpowder. Union forces launched amphibious raids against the coastal salt works of Florida, destroying thousands of boiling kettles and furnaces that worked day and night to distill salt from seawater. The decisive blow came with the attacks on Saltville, Virginia, the Confederacy's primary inland salt source. In 1864, General George Stoneman led a raid that successfully destroyed the salt works, smashing the evaporation pans and ruining the wells. The loss of Saltville crippled the Confederacy's ability to preserve meat for the Army of Northern Virginia. The resulting spoilage of food stocks contributed significantly to the malnutrition and desertion that plagued Lee's army in the final months of the war. The shortage also triggered internal social unrest. Salt riots broke out in the South, most notably in Atlanta and Mobile, and were linked to the broader bread riots in Richmond and Savannah. Women, desperate to feed their families, looted stores and warehouses, demanding salt at fair prices. In Georgia, the price of salt was tiered based on military service, with widows of soldiers receiving it for free, illustrating how the state attempted to use salt rationing to maintain morale. The salt famine remained a defining misery of the Confederate experience, illustrating how the lack of a single mineral can undermine both the logistics of an army and the legitimacy of a government. The failure of Napoleon's 1812 invasion of Russia is often attributed to the general winter, but modern analysis highlights the catastrophic role of logistical failure, specifically the lack of salt. As the Grande Armée retreated from Moscow, the breakdown of supply lines meant that the troops had no salt to preserve fresh meat, nor to season the meager forage they could find. The consumption of unsalted, raw, or rotting horseflesh caused severe dysentery and digestive collapse among the soldiers. Without salt, the body cannot effectively retain water or absorb nutrients, exacerbating the effects of starvation and hypothermia. Equally critical was the impact on the cavalry and transport horses. Horses have a high biological requirement for sodium, especially when exerting themselves. The lack of salt in their diet, combined with the freezing temperatures and poor fodder, led to a mass die-off of the equine force. Without horses, the French artillery had to be abandoned, and the supply wagons could not move. The physiological collapse of the horses turned the retreat into a rout. Furthermore, recent DNA evidence from mass graves in Vilnius indicates that the starving soldiers, weakened by malnutrition, exacerbated by salt deficiency, which aids nutrient absorption and fluid retention, fell victim to typhus and trench fever, as well as Salmonella enterica, a foodborne pathogen likely spread through the consumption of spoiled, unsalted meat. The salt starvation of 1812 serves as a grim testament to the fact that an army marches on its stomach, and that stomach requires sodium. Labor and exploitation, the political economy of extraction. The procurement of salt has historically been one of the most brutal forms of labor. The geological environments where salt is found, arid deserts, subterranean caverns, and coastal marshes, are often hostile to human life. To extract value from these environments, states and elites developed systems of coerced labor that reduced human beings to expendable instruments of production. In the Roman Empire, the sentence damnatio ad metalla, condemnation to the mines, was effectively a delayed death penalty. Criminals, war captives, and persecuted Christians were stripped of all rights and status, becoming servi pone, penal slaves. Sent to the salt mines, they labored in darkness and choking dust or in the blinding heat of evaporation pans. The conditions were horrific. Poor ventilation, toxic fumes, and brutal discipline meant that life expectancy was short. The Roman legal system viewed this not just as a means of production, but as a form of retributive justice, using the body of the criminal to extract the mineral that sustained the empire. While specific archaeological evidence of salt mine conditions is rarer than that of silver or gold mines, the legal framework of damnatio applied equally to all extractive industries, reducing the human being to a speaking tool, instrumentum vocale, to be used until destruction. In the Americas, the Maya civilization utilized salt production as a mechanism of political control and labor exploitation. At the Salinas of Sacapulas in Guatemala, historical records indicate that war captives were forced to work the salt pans. These captives were kept in caves at night and driven to the pans at dawn, their labor directly enriching the Quiche rulers. Salt was a form of stored wealth, and the control of the labor force that produced it was a key component of Mayan statecraft. The tools used were not metal picks but stone blades, which recent use-wear analysis suggests were also used for salting fish on site, integrating the extraction of salt with the preservation of protein. Similarly, in the Sahara, the mines of Tagaza were worked by slaves who lived in abject misery. Ibn Battuta described Tagaza as a village with no good in it, a place plagued by flies and bitter water where the only residents were the slaves of the Masufa tribe who dug the salt. These workers were entirely dependent on food imports brought by the caravans. If a caravan was delayed, the miners starved. This total dependency created a system of extreme exploitation, where the worker was trapped by the very desert that yielded the wealth. The blocks of salt they cut built the empires of Mali and Songhai, yet the miners themselves lived in houses built of salt. effectively entombed in the product of their labor. In medieval and early modern Europe, the salt mines of Wieliczka in Poland operated under a system of serfdom and rigid social hierarchy. The miners were often bound to the land or the mine, working in dangerous conditions to extract the gray gold for the Polish crown. The mine itself was a subterranean city with a complex social structure, from the diggers and carriers to the skilled craftsmen and royal administrators. While not chattel slavery, it was a system of coerced labor where the wealth generated by the salt supported the opulence of the Wawel castle and the Polish nobility, while the miners faced the constant risks of collapse, fire, and methane explosions. The contrast between the exquisite salt chandeliers and chapels carved by the miners, such as the Chapel of St. Kinga, and the grueling reality of their daily labor, highlights the profound disparity inherent in the salt economy. The miners created beauty and wealth in the dark, fueling the economy of a commonwealth that kept them bound to the earth. Religious and symbolic significance, the salt of the covenant. Beyond its economic and biological utility, salt occupies a rarefied space in the human imagination. Across disparate cultures and epochs, salt appears as a universal symbol of purity, permanence, and divine protection. This symbolism is rooted in the mineral's chemical properties. Salt preserves organic matter from decay, keeping corruptible flesh in a state of stasis. To the ancient mind, salt possessed the power to arrest death, making it the perfect emblem for eternity and the divine. In the Abrahamic traditions, salt is the binding agent of sacred agreements. The covenant of salt mentioned in the Hebrew Bible represents an irrevocable promise between God and his people. Because salt does not rot or spoil, a covenant sealed with salt is eternal. In Leviticus, it is commanded that, "With all thine offerings thou shalt offer salt," ensuring that the sacrifice is preserved and purified for the deity. This tradition persists in Judaism, where bread is dipped in salt on the Sabbath, recalling the ancient temple sacrifices and the permanence of the bond with the divine. The very word salvation shares its etymological root with salt, suggesting that to be saved is to be preserved from spiritual decay. In Christianity, this symbolism translates into the spiritual realm. Jesus refers to his disciples as the salt of the earth, implying that they are the preserving agents of the world, preventing its moral corruption. In the Catholic tradition, salt has historically been used in the rite of baptism and the preparation of holy water, acting as a spiritual disinfectant to exorcise evil and protect the soul. The incorruptibility of salt becomes a metaphor for the immortality of the spirit. The use of salt in exorcisms, where it is often sprinkled on thresholds or mixed with water, reinforces its role as a barrier against the demonic. In Eastern traditions, salt's power is explicitly purifying. In Shintoism, salt is shiogama, a substance that clears away kegare, impurity or pollution. Before a sumo match, wrestlers throw handfuls of salt into the ring to drive away evil spirits and purify the sacred space. This act is not merely theatrical, it is a ritual cleansing rooted in the belief that salt repels negative energy. Similarly, in Japanese households, small piles of salt, morishio, are placed at entrances to ward off bad luck and welcome benevolent spirits. In the Aztec pantheon, the goddess Huixtochihuatl presided over salt and salt water. She was honored with a festival where a woman representing the goddess was sacrificed, her heart offered to the deity to ensure the continued provision of salt. This highlights the connection between salt, fertility, and the life-giving and life-taking power of the gods. In Slavic cultures, the combination of bread and salt constitutes the supreme gesture of hospitality. Bread represents the substance of life, while salt represents the flavor and preservation of life. To offer bread and salt to a guest is to offer them protection and brotherhood. The Russian word for hospitality, khlebasolny, literally means bready, salty. This ritual, performed for everyone from visiting dignitaries to astronauts returning from space, establishes a bond of trust. Those who have eaten salt together are bound by a mutual obligation of friendship that cannot be easily broken. It is a social covenant, mirroring the religious covenants of the ancient world. The refusal of bread and salt is considered a grave insult, a rejection of peace and social bonding. Biological dependency and public health, from necessity to crisis. The history of salt is also a biological history of the human species. Our physiological relationship with sodium chloride is a legacy of our evolutionary origins in the primordial ocean. When the first vertebrates moved from the sea to the land, they carried with them an internal ocean of saline fluids. To survive in a terrestrial environment poor in sodium, early humans evolved powerful physiological mechanisms to conserve salt, including the hormone aldosterone, which aggressively signals the kidneys to retain sodium. We also evolved a salt appetite, a robust neural reward system that makes salt taste intensely pleasurable, driving us to seek out this scarce mineral whenever it was available. For most of human history, this craving served us well. Salt was rare, and acquiring enough of it was a survival challenge. However, the Industrial Revolution and the advent of modern food processing inverted this dynamic. With the development of geological mining and industrial evaporation, salt became cheap and ubiquitous. The transition occurred rapidly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Salt shifted from being a precious preservative used to cure meats for winter to being a cheap additive used to enhance palatability and manipulate the physical properties of processed food. In the mid-20th century, the food industry discovered that salt was a miracle ingredient for profit maximization. It masked the bitter flavors of cheap ingredients, enhanced the texture of processed meats, and crucially, increased water retention. By adding salt, manufacturers could sell water at the price of meat. Furthermore, the thirst-inducing property of salt became a strategic tool for the beverage industry, with salty snacks driving the consumption of soft drinks and alcohol. This industrial conspiracy of palatability fundamentally altered the human diet, hiding vast amounts of sodium in products that do not even taste particularly salty, such as bread and cereals. The result is an evolutionary mismatch of catastrophic proportions. The modern human body, designed to scavenge for milligrams of sodium on the African savanna, is now inundated with grams of it daily, often 10 times the physiological requirement. The kidneys, evolved to hoard salt, struggle to excrete the excess. The result is a global epidemic of hypertension, high blood pressure, stroke, and cardiovascular disease. The fluid retention caused by excess sodium increases blood volume, straining the arterial walls and the heart. This biological crisis has triggered a new political battle, reminiscent of the salt debates of antiquity. Public health organizations advocate for sodium reduction, citing overwhelming evidence from studies like DASH sodium. Opposing them are industrial lobbying groups such as the Salt Institute, which have historically employed tactics to obscure scientific consensus and protect the commercial viability of high-sodium processed foods. The debate has shifted from the state's right to tax salt to the state's responsibility to regulate it, marking the latest chapter in the political history of this mineral. The story of salt is far more than the history of a condiment. It is a lens through which the entire spectrum of human endeavor can be viewed, from the brine-boiling peasants of the Han Dynasty to the salt-starved soldiers of Napoleon's retreat, and from the caravans of the Sahara to the hypertension wards of modern hospitals. Salt has been a silent protagonist in the drama of civilization. It has built empires through taxation and destroyed them through rebellion. It has forged the physical infrastructure of the world, turning disjointed settlements into connected economies. It has decided the outcomes of wars, serving as a strategic lever that could bring armies to their knees. It has symbolized our deepest spiritual hopes for purity and permanence, even as our biological drive for it has turned into a modern health liability. In the final analysis, the history of salt reveals a fundamental paradox. The very substance that we once engaged in wars to possess, and which we viewed as a divine gift of immortality, has become a cheap industrial commodity that now threatens our health through its excess. Yet, whether as a fiscal shackle, a white gold, or a hidden killer, salt remains, as it has always been, the essence of life itself, the crystal around which the history of humanity has crystallized.